I'm Julie, and I'll be refuting the claim of violence within the transgender community exists due to a lack of policy. My counterclaim is that violence within the transgender community exists not due to the lack of policy. So the definition of transgender is just denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. And hate crimes is a crime motivated by malice towards someone's identity, perceived identity, or affiliation with a specific group. So the counter-supporting claims are the transgender death is constantly increasing even with protective policy. And second one is transgender individuals do face higher rates of sexual assaults from people even with protective policies. And police policies are not interfering with the investigation of crimes. So the first point shows that the transgender death is constantly increasing. 25 transgender people died in 2017, and 23 died in 2016, and 21 died in 2015, so you can see a constant trend. But it's not really coming from the lack of protective policy, but it's more that in the Broussard experiment, he showed that there's a survey of how people do not approve of the transgender community because of the gender non-conforming individuals felt more threatening to them because they didn't specify whether they're a man or a woman, which caused a lot of problems to the bathroom issues or changing locker rooms and stuff like that. So, but however, there are protective policies to protect those transgender community. In California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, and many more shows that they do have a lot of policies, like how Nevada law bans discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodation like restaurants, hospitals, and retail stores. And also in New York City, they had inclusive policies for the LGBT residents, but Brooklyn still saw a lot of hate crimes going on. So the second point is that the transgender do face higher rates of sexual assaults from the people, and they do have also protective policies on top of that. The 58% of the homeless gay and transgender youth has been sexually assaulted, and compared to the 33% who were heterosexual youth. And so basically, it does show this higher rate, but there are protective policies with Title IX in schools, how transgender students will still be protected from sexual harassment, and also since the harassment in transgender community is a lot higher than heterosexual, the Fair Housing Act also prohibits discrimination based on sex in the sale or retail of housing and the mortgage lending, and also it prohibits the discrimination based on the gender identity, sexual orientation, or the martial status of all federally funded housing programs. So, which that includes homeless shelters. And lastly, is the police policies are not interfering with the investigation of crimes. There is before the police takes into the custody of the transgender victim, they actually ask them the right to express their preference of the gender of the officer who will conduct the research, and that information will be relayed to the jail and the officers who's taking them in that they are a transgender person. And also in the main claim that I'm refuting is that he stated that only the police will look at the IDs and not their accurate information up to date. But in many states, it shows that transgender people can only attain an ID if they performed a surgery or they actually show that they have a disability of gender dysphoria, but they can't attain the ID unless the up-to-date ID unless they prove that. So it's really hard for this transgender community to even show that kind of ID to the police. So, and also, not only that, the police officers are getting misinterpreted, that they're not relying that accurate information. And in Dallas Police Department, it shows that Carla Forrest Pavon was strangled dead in her apartment in May, but the police officer in the Dallas Police Department shows that he went around saying she and Carla throughout the investigation, and he stated, when we go out to the community and talk about somebody, we have to identify them in a way that they want to be identified, and it will help them in the investigation to go on. So the transgender community is a vulnerable target to society. However, it's not because of lack of policy, but it's more of the hate crime towards the transgender community. Thank you.
All right, just a couple of things with the language issue. The word "not" being used in your counterclaim is a little confusing. I think you could suggest that the source of the problem is something else, and you kind of identify what that something else is. It is the broader prejudice or bias against transgender individuals as opposed to the absence of policies. I thought that you previewed the advocate's claims pretty clearly. Your arguments, though, don't necessarily follow up that structure in the same way. There is an organization to them, but the claims are not as distinct as they ought to be. You concede the notion that there's a trend of increasing violence against transgenders. I'm not sure that the differences of 2 to 3 murders each year, which, by the way, are horrible one way or the other, establishes a trend. There may, in fact, be explanations as to why those numbers exist within the small range that we're looking at here. You seem to be willing to concede, though, that in general it's going up again in that way. And I'm going, well, maybe. The Broussard experiment that you refer to is a little unclear. This is the one that seems to establish that there is a widespread prejudice against transgendered individuals, either because men or women feel threatened by them, they see them as being the other, that they have problems as a consequence in social situations as a result of that. I think that's probably a pretty solid argument that there are other reasons that these problems exist. I think some of that is being placed on the general population, although as I recall, the advocate suggested that there may in fact be some blame to go around with the transgender population as well, concerning some of their sexual behaviors and their housing conditions, that those things are the things that might put them in vulnerable situations where this creates that. So the idea that it's related to a policy, I think there are good counter arguments to suggest other things account for this. The thing that I thought did the best for you is the demonstration that there are policies that address these kinds of issues. You mentioned Title IX, you mentioned the fair housing rules, you talk about California and a number of other states having policies in regard to transgendered individuals and the way that they are identified. So it sounds to me like there are a number of rules that guide our interactions with transgendered individuals, and the suggestion that there aren't, and that's the source of the problem, is undermined by the presence of these laws. I do think you want to cite them a little bit more completely. I know you got information from someplace, but I couldn't tell you exactly where it comes from. The example of the police investigation down in Dallas is a pretty good counter illustration of how the agencies operate differently. You have an earlier argument that says the police policies are, their goal is to identify people in a way that's going to make it easy for them to investigate the crime. The side issue that says that these folks can't get identification because they have to meet particular kinds of requirements, I don't know that that helps your position. That really seems like it helps the position of the advocate in this situation. Here's the absence of a policy that would allow them to be protected by being able to be identified, and we've got a policy that says no, you can't do that, and that seems to me to feed the advocate's argument in that situation. Okay, thank you.